It's time to level up your business with the biggest ad sale of the year. We've got it all at crazy discounted rates. Radio, TV, and social media. Want to make big sales? You need to be where the people are. And guess what? They're tuned into ZIZ, the #1 broadcast network in the Federation. Maximum reach, unbeatable deals, and 64 years of trusted media power. Don't get left behind. Secure your spot now before they're gone. Call our marketing team at 662-8203 or email sales@ZIZonline.com today. It's ZIZ March Madness. 64 years strong, where your brand belongs.
Welcome back. You're tuned into Pleasure Pulse on ZIZ Radio, Facebook, and YouTube. I'm your host, Roma Richardson, and we are here for another Tuesday edition of Pleasure Pulse. Last week, if you joined us or if you caught the conversation after it was live, we talked about sexual agency, which is not a new topic to the show, but I wanted to revisit it again last week to talk about what the benefits of sexual agency, what it results in, how it contributes to different aspects of our lives. And I also talked about how it can help folks in their sexual interactions, and essentially sexual agency is, well, it's hoped, it's believed that it can contribute to more pleasurable and supportive, positive sexual experiences. So we talked about things like how sexual agency can help result in things like, or can contribute to things like mutual respect, clear communication, increased confidence, mutual pleasure, clear consent, boundaries, and respect for boundaries. And we also talked about how it connects with things like emotional safety and can result in folks wanting to explore more and to grow more when it comes to their sexuality and their sexual lives. So as a reminder, sexual agency, and this is especially for folks who may have tuned in late and missed the definition. Sexual agency is especially in the context of mutually pleasurable sex, refers to each person's ability to make informed, autonomous choices about their own body, desires, and boundaries. Or it's the ability to identify, communicate, and negotiate your sexual needs, as well as to pursue behaviors that allow you to satisfy those needs. So sexual agency is the thing that, and agency in general is about autonomy, the ability to pursue something that you desire, the ability to control some aspect of your life, whatever type of or whatever issue it is we're talking about. That is what agency is. So with both partners, when they both have a sense of agency, it creates an environment where both can feel empowered to communicate openly and honestly about what they enjoy and what they don't, as well as their boundaries, any concerns they might have, any tips they might have. So people might also have feedback that they want to give. Sexual agency enables folks to be able to give feedback, to share how they are honestly and truly feeling. And we especially talked about sexual agency when it comes to women, particularly in heterosexual relationships, but it applies to everyone and all kinds of relationships. But I zeroed in on heterosexual relationships because of how, patriarchy, gender norms, sexual scripts, all of those things set up so that women in relationship with men tend to get the disadvantaged side of things, or the short end of the stick, as we like to call it, when it comes to sexuality, because women tend to be the ones who are discouraged essentially from being sexual agents, who are taught that, being sexual is something that is for men, that you should be docile or you should be submissive, you shouldn't be too eager to initiate things, or you come off as a certain type of way. So I talked about it in the context of heterosexual relationships because of that broader environment and those broader messages that we receive. But it's not because sexual agency is not a thing in other types of relationships. So when women have agency in particular, it helps to create a safe and fulfilling space for great sex because it empowers them to assert their needs, to communicate boundaries, and engage in sexual experiences that feel respectful, consensual, and enjoyable. And I talked earlier about, as a recap of what we discussed last week. Now tonight I want to continue that conversation, but I want to focus on how we can actually build or cultivate sexual agency. And agency, more broadly, is something that we want to teach our children, teach people around us from small to build or to hone and develop, because agency, a lot of people view it like a skill or as a set of skills. So it's something that we want to start with folks from small, teaching people that their bodies are their own, that nobody else has a right to their body, that they have and should have full control and autonomy over their bodies, over what happens to their bodies. We talk about good touch, bad touch, quote unquote, for children, but it goes, much more beyond that, right? Because it also means that we teach our children to even have boundaries with us. So our children may sometimes say, no, I don't feel like giving mommy a hug, or I don't feel like giving mommy a kiss right now because I have the choice to say that. And the example comes up with family members a lot, and the encouragement to parents, for example, not to force children to hug or kiss other family members if they don't want to, because then that teaches them that their boundaries don't matter, that their perspectives don't matter, their needs don't matter, their wants don't matter. And that's not what we want to teach our children, because children who learn that become adults who believe that too and who have to unlearn that, right? So it's better if we just start off on, a good and positive, particularly a sex positive space by building agency and teaching our children the skills to build their agency, which takes practice and it takes time, because I feel like even as an adult, it's so difficult for us to say no, not just when it comes to sexual activity, but when it comes to anything. Like, people ask us to do favors and we really want to tell them no, we can't do it because we're not able to for whatever reason, or we just don't feel like it. But somehow we feel pressured to say yes. Oftentimes that translates or transfers over into our sexual lives, where we don't really want to do something, or we have concern about something, or we're hesitant about something. We want more information. We want, it to go slower. We want more pauses, and we kind of go along with it because we have been taught that that's what we're supposed to do, right? So I want to talk about how we can actually build or cultivate that agency for ourselves. And as I mentioned, it's really good if it starts in childhood. But if you are an adult and you are perhaps new to the term, but not necessarily new to the idea of it, or perhaps if you are new to the idea of it, or you're familiar with it, but you still find that there are times when it is trickier for you, because a lot of people see sexual agency as a spectrum, right? And not like you're either an agent or you're not, because there are so many examples of where people demonstrate acts of agency, even in situations where there is some level of victimization, right? So we like to see sexual agency as a spectrum. So it's something that can grow, it's something that can be worked on, and it's something that we can develop. So in my reading for the show tonight, I came across this sexual and reproductive health and rights researcher called Judith Westerning, and she describes sexual agency as a continuum of dynamic, everyday, situation, modalities of action related to sexuality. And this is a really academic definition. But the important thing to take away is that it's a continuum of dynamic, everyday situations related to sexuality in which agents navigate personal goals, desires, and preferences on one hand, and personal living conditions, expectations, and norms, and the wider social structure or structural context on the other hand. So sexual agency also doesn't happen just in a 2x4 room, right? It occurs in a broader context. So what are the things that you have learned about how someone who looks like you, who is the gender that you are, should behave when it comes to sex, right? And there are lots of things that we are constantly navigating and negotiating when it comes to sexual agency. And there are internal goals or external goals. So for example, there might be things that we want to achieve for ourselves when it comes to, or things that we desire for ourselves when it comes to sexuality, but those things might be different to what the community around us sees as the norm or sees as normal or practices regularly, right? Especially if, we are not even especially, but for example, we might be into certain kinks that people don't talk about practicing, commonly and so on, as well as we might be a woman who is very comfortable, typically the initiator when it comes to sex. Like even someone like that might be seen as disrupting the status quo when it comes to sexuality and sexual agency. And they also talk about how sexual agency could be overt or in your face, or it could be more tacit, and it varies with individuals as well as situations. So it also takes some, pragmatism. I don't really like the word because I already said I'm an idealistic person. But I recognize the importance of being pragmatic sometimes, and diplomatic, and all of those kinds of words. So sometimes, there is that situation where it might vary with individual and situational requirements, right? So what you might do in certain situations with different people might change. So it might not always be the same level or the same kind, the same type of sexual agency with everybody, depending on what's going on around you, who it is you're dealing with, your level of comfort with them, and so on. So as I mentioned earlier, researchers tend to see it as a set of skills that once they're well developed can support things like voice, choice, and power, freedom of movement, decision making, collective action, and so on. And so it is how we successfully navigate all of the things happening around us, including with the gendered or gender related environment in terms of what people of different genders are expected to do and be, and how they're expected to act. And how all of the possibilities around us are filtered through and passed through. So it is a continuous process of negotiating multiple desires, norms, and possibilities. And so when we talk about sexual agency as a scale, we mean that it takes into account all of this, working around, the responsibility to be able to assess and evaluate a situation to see what will ensure your safety, your comfort, your boundaries, your desires, your pleasures in that moment. And of course, it is a marker of or an element of healthy sexual development, and it's also very important for sexual empowerment. Now, another researcher talks about how, when we navigate sexuality, and this is something I mentioned earlier, it takes place within this social context. For example, the context of family or friends and peer relations, as well as what's going on culturally, what's going on legally. So, for example, I can't remember if it was this show a couple of weeks ago, or I was in a conversation with some other folks, and we were talking about dating culture. I think I may have brought this up last week. We were talking about dating culture, especially among young people, and how that has changed or has not changed from like my generation and previous generations. And I think, but I'm not really sure about previous generations. There's the generation that talked about courting and things like that, where the person used to come to your house and speak to your parents and all of these things, sit down in your living room and have conversations that were supervised. But I know in my generation, dating wasn't really a thing, because especially for women and girls, to be seen with, and I'm talking heterosexual women and girls, to be seen with multiple boys or men is to essentially condemn yourself to, or subject yourself to rumors and all of these things, which might not, I think usually are not even grounded in reality, but it's just, sometimes you're just standing up on 4th Street talking to a person, and then by the time you reach home, you see a message from somebody say, "Oh, I see you talking to this person," or "This person tell me that they see you talking to this person. That's your man," and that's essentially like just from a conversation, and that is a real possibility. So imagine if you are seen out with multiple people in romantic settings, right? So all of a sudden you are sexually involved with all of these people, and everybody isn't necessarily okay with the idea of that being, the things that are said about them. And one of the things that has to happen for people to become or gain more sexual agency is the environment around them has to become supportive to, the development of sexual agency, which means it has to become supportive to the development or the exploration of things like dating, of things like going out with multiple people, which puts the, control and autonomy and decision making within the person to actively choose who it is they want to be with, rather than by default end up in a situation for fear of being called names because they went out with subsequent other people, right? So navigating sexuality takes place within that context. And so sexual agency, and the context, we're also talking about the legal context as well, because the law also regulates what we can or cannot do as individuals when it comes to our sexual lives. So all of those contexts help to shape our agency. And so some folks argue that agency has to be thought of as not just an outward performance or something that is just individual or internal, but as something that is developed, kind of collectively and in that community kind of sense. So that way, we can change how we frame conversations. We can talk about the issue, we could talk about the systems, we could talk about the structures, rather than blame individuals for things that happen, because everything happens within a particular context. Now, I'm going to take a short break there. I think that was quite a lot to take in. And when we come back, I will get into more of the actual tips that we can use to cultivate our sexual agency. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Pleasure Pulse. I'm your host, Roma Richardson, and you are listening to me on ZIZ Radio, Facebook, and YouTube. As I mentioned, we still don't have any video, but video will be back very soon, probably next week, hopefully. So you'll be able to see me again. I still won't be able to see you because I guess that's just how it works. But yeah, so tonight we're talking about sexual agency and how to build it. So how to become or how to practice more sexual agency, how to develop your level or your capacity to act as sexual agent, not like a secret agent, but an agent as in someone who is capable of doing something. So I've shared the definition before, but I'll share it again. A simple one is the ability to identify, communicate, and negotiate your sexual needs and to pursue or initiate behaviors that allow for those needs to be satisfied. So that's a simplish definition of it, but essentially it's about your ability to say, this is what I want, right? Well, to identify, to define for yourself what it is you want. So I've spent some time thinking with myself or thinking in conversation or I've come to these conclusions based on conversations with other people because that's also how I've arrived at my sexual sense of self, in conversation with other women, in conversation with men, so on. So however you have, come to certain conclusions, at least for the moment, about what it is you desire, about what it is you're interested in, about your feelings towards certain things, about your boundaries, so the things that you will do, the things that you will not do, or will allow or won't allow. And then, after identifying those things, being able to say those things to particularly the other people with whom you will have sex, and also to negotiate your sexual needs. And negotiation, oftentimes when we talk about negotiation, we're talking about negotiation of safer sex, but it could be negotiation of other things, right? Because sex is just big and vast and there's lots that is possible. But let's say we're talking about safer sex, having conversations with your partners about what forms of contraception you want to use, how often you want to get tested, whether you prefer to get tested together or alone, what conversations you want to have after getting tested, and so on. But being in a space where you can articulate that you have a preference or that you have a requirement for whatever types of safer sex methods, and also to pursue behaviors that allow for those needs to be satisfied. So being able to go after what it is you want and not feeling like, oh, I can't initiate because if I initiate, they're gonna say that I am promiscuous, or because I think that has happened, right? That there is assumption that if you go after certain things sexually, then you must have done that before. Or sometimes people also assume that if you are good at a particular sexual act, that you must have done it 100 times, which is also fine, by the way, if you have done it 100 times, like nothing wrong with that. But there are certain associations that we make, assumptions that we make with different people based on what is happening in our sexual space, right? So for example, we don't really we might not allow for the possibility that this person may have done a lot of research and come extremely prepared for this sexual activity. And sometimes, especially with women, the treatment can be like if they are too into an act, that is something wrong with them. So women are expected, and I said this earlier, to not be too sexual, to be more sexual objects and sexual subjects, which also is, a thing that is talked about when we look at agency. So we've talked about sexual agency broadly and how it is considered a continuum, so a range rather than like is either this or is that, is like a line and you could be at different parts of that line. And that's why I talk about like cultivating sexual agency, because I feel like especially with sex, there's always room to improve and to develop and to learn and to grow, because there is, and not just for women but for all of us, there's so much that we have been told about sex, whether it is that we should avoid it, that we shouldn't do it, that is going to lead us to hell or other places. And so there is constantly something to learn or unlearn when it comes to sex. And so that's also why it's good to think of sexual agency as a continuum. Always, like, it's not like you either have it or you don't. So when it comes to tips to actually build that sexual agency and practice that sexual agency, I pulled from a number of different sources. One is Dr. Juliana Hauser, who talked about like a 5-step approach to sexual agency. One, the first step, recognize that there's a decision to be made. 2, be confident to make that decision with purpose and intention. 3, make the decision, decide what you need to do, and take action on it. 4, live with the consequences of that decision, both the intended and unintended. And 5, determine the meaning. What do you take away from the decision? And there were also some notes with those steps, which were: 1, you have to know who you are. So that's going back to the first part of the definition of sexual agency, right? So being able to identify things, whether those things are your desires or your boundaries, your values, what's important to you, where you want to be, how the decisions that you're making will affect or not affect where it is you're trying to get to, whether or not that person that you are pursuing will long-term or short-term be what it is you want. Do they align with your values? Are you ideologically compatible, or are you on other sides, opposite sides of the spectrum? There's also another consideration, which was doing the steps authentically and truthfully. So being honest about what it is, the decisions that you're pursuing and why you're pursuing them. And 3, have a tolerance for ambiguity. So especially when it comes to living with the consequences of your decision, both the unintended or intended, because I'm somebody who has had to do a lot of work when it comes to decision making. I would make a decision and then the next day I'm like, yeah, that was the worst thing that I could have ever done for myself, as opposed to being like, when I was in the moment, it felt like the right decision, and the outcomes that I expected were XYZ. It didn't work like that. So what can I learn from this next time? So when you treat that decision with ambiguity, where you are fine to live with, or you are okay with the potential outcomes or consequences of your decision that can help you to react in ways that are not destructive, and be more accepting of the decisions and the outcome of those actions. And they say that when you put all of these together, it can activate your agency, and that agency will be true to who you are. Because, yeah, I mean, especially when it comes to sex, we won't always, I mean, some people probably maybe do, but lots of us don't always make, in hindsight, the right or best decisions. But that is also a huge part of growing as a sexual person, being able to say, in hindsight, this is what I could have done differently. Or if a situation like this comes up again, this is how I would deal with it now. But usually we are dealing with situations or decision making with the information that we have at the time, in the situation that we're in at the time, with the tools that are available to us at the time. So that's why the advice there is to also not be too hard on ourselves. And they also provided some other tips to activate our sexual agency. And they suggested completing a sexual acts exercise. So, for example, writing down sexual acts that you've done that you would like to do again, things that you've done that you don't think you want to do again, things that you haven't done but may want to try, things you haven't done that you don't want to try, at least for now. And especially if you are partnered, you could compare that list with your partner to see how you align or not, what you are open to or not. And of course, we're talking about going through this exercise in advance, ahead of time, in a non-sexual environment. And I always talk about having conversations like these outside of the bedroom. And when I say the bedroom, I don't mean literally the bedroom, because you could have them in the bedroom. It's just having them outside of a non-sexual environment. You also want to ensure that you're discussing things like consent early and often, because that also helps us to build sexual agency or sexual confidence. So remember, I talked about building or equipping our children, starting small with our children to equip them with these tools for sexual agency. That can help us to, be reminded of what consent is, what it isn't, and ensure consent is always present in any interactions that we have. And I also found some more advice, which was this part of the advice was more specific to you as an individual, and it centers around getting comfortable and enjoying yourself. So people often recommend that if you have discomfort with your body, or maybe you just need to reacquaint yourself with your body, maybe you're kind of comfortable with it, but there's still more to go. A way to boost your self-confidence is to look at yourself naked. And so the advice too was also to stand naked in a mirror every morning. View yourself as you are, like nothing else, no clothes to hide nothing, no socks to hide nothing, no makeup to cover any marks or any things that you're extra hyper conscious about, and steady until you find something good to say about yourself, right? So like at the end of this show tonight, even if that's all you do, start to practice that mirror affirmation moment where you stand naked in front of the mirror until you find something good to say about yourself, and you do it every morning. When you're able to hear those positive things, first of all, it's easier to believe when you hear it from other people, but it also helps you to feel more confident. And if you're more confident, the idea is that you will be more comfortable asserting sexual agency, talking about what it is you need. Because now it's like, I love and respect this person that I am. So that is the minimum that I would accept from another person. And another tip to embrace sexual agency is discussing sexual behaviors and desires out loud. And I mentioned that earlier, with the exercise that you could do with a partner, or you could do it with alone. So talking about the things that you enjoy, the things that maybe you don't enjoy as much, the things that you've never tried but you're willing to try, the things that you've tried that you don't want to try again. There are things that you're open to with more conversation, or with an example or a visual aid or a demonstration, right? And those tips come from Queen Media Collective. So let me just recap some of those tips that will help you to build sexual agency. Being cognizant or aware that there's a decision to be made, being confident to make that decision with purpose and intention, make the decision and decide what you need to do to take action on it, live with the consequences of the decision, and determine the meaning of it. So what do you take away from the decision? And to help to actually activate that, you can do an exercise around sexual acts, which is, and this can help you to become very clear and specific about desires, boundaries, interests, and so on. So those 4 examples that I mentioned that you could, this list that you could do with your partner or alone, were sexual acts that you've done that you like to do again, ones that you've done that you don't think you want to do again, ones that you haven't done but you may want to try, and ones that you haven't done that you don't want to try for now, or maybe have no interest in at all. And do lists like that with your partner to, and I think it's a good way to like ease into it, and especially for people who may not be as comfortable yet, like just getting up and putting up your hand to have a conversation. If you write it down, you take some time, maybe alone, or you do it together. You could do it separately and then come together to discuss it. It will give you some time to really, without the pressure, right, of the other person, to think about what it is you want. And it does remove or add certain levels of comfort through being able to write it that you may not yet have to speak it just so. And of course, I mentioned, discussing consent early and often. And so, yeah, those are some small things that you can do to help to cultivate or practice your sexual agency. Along with those things, I would encourage you to read more about it. But I really also want you to just remember the definition, which is being able to identify your sexual needs, communicate those sexual needs, negotiate those sexual needs, and go after the things that will allow for those needs to be met or satisfied. So, yeah, I've talked about how it happens within, social, cultural context and all of those things. But every day, all of us do something that's a little disruptive, right? Like it's a little against the status quo. That's a little different to what we were told or taught. And this can be another set of those things that we can practice. And we might start outside of sexual agency. We might just start with agency in general. So we might start something at work, or we might start it at church. Like, okay, I am in 5 different church groups right now, and I am running myself ragged. Not only that, in all of the church groups, I am the one person that everybody counts on, and I need a break. You might start by writing all of those things that you're in down, saying, what are the things that I want to continue participating in? What are the things that I'm really excited, eager, committed to? What are the groups that I can maybe let go of? In those groups then that I've decided to commit to, what are the things that I'm willing to continue to take on, and what are the things that I'm going to start to say no to? And it might be as small or as big, I don't know, it depends on how you frame it, as I'm going to say no to this additional church service that has come up, and I'm going to commit to what I've already committed to, but I'm not going to take on anything additional, right? So that's you practicing your agency. And you could also start to say no to certain things. So you realize that you're the one that everybody always comes to. Say, I can't do that. You might go and take additional steps and suggest someone else or suggest an alternative path they can take, but you can also be fine with saying, no, I can't do that. And that's, you could start there, or there might be something even smaller that you can start to practice this agency with. And then when you are ready, you can transfer it over to sexual agency, or you could start with sexual agency and then see how that also applies to other aspects of your life, right? But all in all, I want you to start to practice and start to actively cultivate, and pay attention to how you are applying or asserting your agency. Because I also mentioned, agency doesn't look the same. Sometimes we are being agents and we don't even realize it. So I've just given you a kind of structure, at least through the definition, with which or through which you can think of agency. And then the same Dr. Hauser that I mentioned also provided some takeaways when it comes to sexual agency. So, and this is where I'm going to leave you tonight. Things I want you to remember, things they want you to remember that I'm repeating. What you need and want matters. You have to discover your yeses and your nos. And I like to emphasize not just your nos, but also your yeses. Like, what are the things that you want in addition to what you don't want? It's important to continue learning and absorbing the concept of agency. Sexuality and sex is fun, and it is even more fun when we are able to practice sexual agency and be in spaces where that is encouraged and validated. And instead of thinking of consent as, let me not say that. Just use terms like yucks and yums to reinforce enthusiastic consent. Which is, sometimes there's the saying, don't yuck somebody's yum. So your partner might be interested in something that you're not interested in, or you might be interested in something that your partner is not interested in. That doesn't mean that what your partner is interested in or what you are interested in is bad or not normal or anything like that. You just like what you like, and they like what they like. So don't yuck nobody yum. So instead of thinking of consent as, we can think of consent as something that we can enthusiastically give, enthusiastically receive, something that is exciting to establish. Okay. Yeah. So I hope that this conversation was helpful. I'm going to remind you of the definition of again, so that if you didn't write it down before, you can write it down now. But sexual agency is the ability to identify, communicate, and negotiate your sexual needs and to initiate behaviors that allow for those needs to be satisfied. So it is you taking charge of your sexual life, your sexual experiences, your sexual desires, sexual empowerment. It's you taking charge of your pleasure, taking control of your experiences, and ensuring that you are in your body at all times, right? So it also requires consent, it requires communication. It helps to improve or ensure levels of pleasure. It helps to provide emotional safety, and it helps to create a space where people can explore and grow sexually. So I want you to at least practice one step of that or one part of that definition, whether it is just to identify what your sexual needs are. And if you've already done that, or if you already know them, to take steps to communicate them, to talk to your partner about them. And as I've mentioned, usually best to do outside of a sexual environment where the pressure, of performance and so on is not there, and people don't are less likely to take things as personally. Or if you've already communicated, to move into negotiating your sexual needs. So if you realize that there's more conversation that's required about something that you asserted or something that you identify as one of your needs, if you realize maybe the person didn't fully get or fully understand what you meant when you described this thing that you wanted to do, that requires negotiation and conversation. If you realize you talked about wanting to use condoms and the person shows up without condoms, it means having a conversation about what we're gonna do now, because no condoms here, and I'm not going to have sex without a condom. And then if you've already done that, being able to, whoever you are, wherever you are, once it's safe, take steps or initiate behaviors that allow for your needs to be met. Because we always say closed mouths don't get fed. You first have to open your mouth, you have to talk, you have to say what you want, and then you can receive what it is you need, what it is you desire, and we can have more pleasurable and fulfilling sexual experiences. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Pleasure Pulse. As usual, it's a safe space where no conversation or topic is too big or too small. As usual, I'll wish you a pleasurable evening, and I will see you all next Tuesday. Bye.